Donald Trump arrived late in Davos, as if the World Economic Forum were his personal Reichstag. Initially, he taunted Emmanuel Macron's sunglasses, belittled Canada's Prime Minister, sneered at Swiss sovereignty, and mocked Denmark for its defeat in the Second World War. These insults were not random flourishes, they were the warm-up act. Beneath the bluster lay a more disciplined ideological project, one that relied less on explicit slurs than on coded language, historical myth-making, and familiar tropes about civilization, decay, and purity. Trump was not merely performing nationalism, he was advancing a vision of the West as an embattled racial civilization, under siege from dilution and decline, with himself cast as its last credible defender. In reality, an old, demented white man, ironically painted orange, talking in riddles about the strength and power of other white men and warning them of the other. At first glance, the speech appeared chaotic, another rambling performance designed to dominate headlines. But when stripped of its digressions, a grim coherence emerged. Trump's message was not simply America first. It was civilizational and hierarchical. He was sketching an imagined West defined by inheritance rather than citizenship, by lineage rather than law. This was not the language of policy, but of blood and soil, repackaged for a 21st century audience. Like earlier racial ideologues, Trump spoke obsessively of culture while refusing to define it, allowing the word to function as a proxy for race. To the trained ear, this was pure fascism.
Certain places in Europe are not even recognizable, frankly, anymore. They're not recognizable. And we can argue about it, but there's no argument. Friends come back from different places, I don't want to insult anybody, and say, I don't recognize it. And that's not in a positive way, that's in a very negative way. And I love Europe, and I want to see Europe go good, but it's not heading in the right direction.
This rhetorical move has a long history. Nazi ideology rarely relied solely on crude biological claims. It leaned heavily on the idea of Kultur, an ineffable civilizational essence said to belong organically to certain peoples and not others. Trump's Davos speech echoed this pattern. He insisted that Western greatness arose not from institutions, pluralism, or democracy, but from a very special culture that had lifted humanity from darkness to light. This culture, he warned, was fragile and under threat. The threat was not abstract. It had a name: migration. Trump framed demographic change as civilizational erosion. Parts of Europe, he lamented, were now unrecognizable, as if diversity itself were a form of vandalism. Migration was not treated as a policy challenge or humanitarian reality, but as an invasive force, an idea central to fascist thought, where outsiders are cast as contaminants, weakening the national body. The language was careful, even genteel, but the structure was unmistakable. Civilizations rise when they remain pure, Trump implied, and fall when they allow themselves to be mixed. This logic hardened when Trump turned to the United States. He singled out Somali Americans, recycling stereotypes about fraud, criminality, and intellectual inferiority. He questioned their capacity to integrate and, by extension, the legitimacy of a multicultural society itself. Some cultures, he suggested, had never built anything of value, and therefore had no rightful claim to the West. This was not an accidental slip, but a statement of hierarchy. Some peoples are bearers of civilization, others are merely burdens upon it. Here again, the echoes are historical. Nazi racial theory divided humanity into creators, bearers, and destroyers of culture, with Aryans positioned as the sole true creators. Trump may not have used that language, but the implication was similar. Western prosperity, he argued, was not transferable. It could not be adopted by newcomers. It had to be inherited. Immigration from outside the West was thus framed not as enrichment, but as degradation. The policy implications of this worldview are stark. When culture is treated as racial destiny, exclusion becomes preservation, and expulsion becomes defense. Mass deportations, selective asylum, and the privileging of certain ethnic groups are no longer extreme measures, but logical necessities. Trump has gestured towards this before, invoking bad genes and amplifying conspiracy theories about the Great Replacement theory. In Davos, he extended the argument beyond America. Europe, too, was warned that unless it reasserted control over its population, decline was inevitable. The influence of Stephen Miller, Trump's chief immigration ideologue, was unmistakable. Miller has long promoted a mythologized history in which Western civilization is the exclusive achievement of white Europeans, tracing a straight, sanitized line from classical antiquity to modern America. This narrative erases centuries of exchange, conflict, and hybridity in favor of an ethnic origin story. It is a worldview in which history belongs to our ancestors, and everyone else appears as an interloper. Diversity in this framework is not a demographic strength, but a civilizational threat. This thinking now circulates far beyond the White House. It is reinforced by powerful figures who dress racial panic in the language of realism. Elon Musk has repeatedly amplified claims that white people face extinction, endorsing calls for racial solidarity as a matter of survival. The white replacement theory, once confined to extremist forums, has migrated into mainstream political discourse. Trump's decision to offer asylum to white South Africans on the basis of an imagined genocide fits neatly into this worldview, where victimhood is racialized and protection is selectively applied. Davos also exposed how this racial conception of civilization bleeds into Trump's foreign policy. He portrayed allies as dependents, insisting that Canada and Europe exist only because of American largesse. Trade imbalances became evidence of parasitism. Sovereignty itself was treated as conditional, something granted by stronger nations and revoked at will. Nowhere was this clearer than in his remarks about Greenland. Trump insisted he would not use force to take the territory, even as he repeatedly suggested that the United States would end up with it one way or another. The language oscillated between reassurance and menace. Denmark was described as ungrateful, NATO as lopsided, and Greenland as effectively American by geography and destiny. When Trump warned that refusals would be remembered, the implication was unmistakable. Cooperation was optional, consequences were not. The reaction from European allies was swift and hostile. In Davos, where diplomacy is typically wrapped in euphemism, Trump's mob-like framing, do this the easy way or the hard way, landed badly. His insistence that American restraint alone prevented conflict, coupled with boasts about overwhelming power, left diplomats alarmed rather than reassured. Even as he disavowed the use of force, he made clear that American dominance, economic and military, would be leveraged until compliance followed. This pattern, threat, retreat, repetition, has long characterized Trump's leadership. But the danger lies less in any single policy than in the worldview he normalizes. By presenting the West as a racial inheritance under siege, Trump launders extremist ideas through the language of civilization and security. He transforms racism into responsibility, exclusion into stewardship. The speech ended without immediate catastrophe. No invasion was announced, no tariffs imposed. For those that didn't walk out, there was even a sense of relief in the room. But relief is not reassurance. As Trump left the stage, the most unsettling image was not his rhetoric, but the quiet presence of the military aide carrying the nuclear codes. It was a reminder that these ideas are not abstract. A man who sees the world as a civilizational battlefield, who believes entire cultures are incompatible with modernity, commands extraordinary power. The question is no longer whether Trump's politics echo fascist or Nazi-era ideas about race and civilization. The echoes are clear. The question is how far this vision of a purified West, defended through coercion and myth, will be allowed to shape global politics before it is confronted for what it is and resisted accordingly. Resisted by a European community who are most sensitive to history repeating itself. I'm Anthony Davis. You can find me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, and on Sunday on The Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.